They called it the Iron Curtain, a line on the map, a wall of concrete and wire, a border of floodlights and rifles. But for 500,000 people from Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, it was something else entirely. It was the last obstacle between a life in fear under Soviet domination and a chance at freedom in the West. This is the forgotten story of Eastern Bloc refugees in the Cold War. People who risked prison, bullets, and exile to reach a world they knew only from rumors, radio, and the glow of American technology. And on the other side of that curtain, watching closely, were the United States and its allies, using their economic power, their open society, and their technological lead to send a clear message to Moscow. This is what freedom looks like. When World War II ended, Europe was a continent of ruins and refugees. Cities lay in rubble, train lines were shattered, and millions of civilians wandered across borders that no longer meant what they used to mean. In the East, countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia were pulled into the orbit of the Soviet Union. Pro-Moscow governments took power. New secret police forces were created. Political opponents vanished into prisons and labor camps. At first, people were still on the move for reasons that had little to do with communism. Germans were expelled from Poland and Czechoslovakia. Poles were pushed west as the Soviet Union annexed their eastern territories. Entire communities were uprooted by decisions taken in distant conferences at Yalta and Potsdam. By 1946, hundreds of thousands of Poles, Ukrainians, Balts, and others were still living in displaced persons camps in the western zones of Germany and Austria, refusing to return to lands now ruled by Soviet-backed regimes. They had seen enough to understand what was coming. The Red Army had liberated them from Nazi terror, but it was bringing a different kind of control. One party, one ideology, one truth. In the West, American officers, relief workers, and diplomats watched this refusal to go home and understood it as something more than fear. It was a political statement. These people did not believe they would have basic rights under Soviet domination. In Washington, this mattered. The Cold War was taking shape, and refugees from communist countries were becoming a symbol. Every man, woman, or child who chose the uncertainty of a camp over the certainty of life under a Soviet-backed government was, in a sense, voting with their feet. The United States began to adjust its immigration and refugee policies accordingly, opening special channels for those fleeing communist rule. But as the new regimes in Eastern Europe consolidated their power, something else happened. Leaving became harder, much harder. Across the Eastern Bloc, communist governments built an internal system of control that went far beyond party membership and propaganda. They created passport offices that rarely issued passports, border guard forces with orders to shoot, and criminal codes that defined flight from the Republic as a serious crime. In countries like Czechoslovakia and Hungary, slipping across the border to Austria or West Germany was no longer just illegal, it was treason. Yet people kept trying. Between 1950 and 1990, only about 13.3 million people managed to move from the Eastern Bloc to the West, a relatively small number when compared to the tens of millions of refugees after World War II. But inside that smaller number are the stories that define this era. Poles who used business trips to disappear in the West, Hungarian students who ran across frozen fields at night, Czechoslovak journalists who chose exile over silence. For American audiences, it is easy to think of the Cold War as a standoff of missiles, spies, and speeches. But for the people trapped behind the Iron Curtain, it was also a daily comparison. They listened to Western radio, they watched American movies secretly, they heard about jobs, consumer goods, cars, and the moon landing. And they saw in those images something that terrified Soviet leaders, proof that the capitalist enemy, the United States, had built a society that was not collapsing, but racing ahead. The year 1956 brought that tension into the open in a way no one could ignore.
In Hungary, after years of Stalinist repression, students took to the streets of Budapest, demanding free elections, freedom of speech, and the withdrawal of Soviet troops. For a brief moment, it looked like the country might break free. Soviet forces withdrew. A reformist government took shape. Crowds cheered in the streets. And then the tanks came back. In November, Soviet armor rolled into Budapest, crushing the uprising with brutal force. The streets that had seen jubilant crowds now saw gunfire, barricades, and desperate resistance. When it was over, the regime was restored, but the people's trust was not. The response was flight. In the months that followed, around 171,000 Hungarians crossed into Austria and another 20,000 into Yugoslavia in one of the largest refugee waves of the early Cold War. They crossed fields in the dark, guided by rumors about which stretches of the border were less heavily guarded. They waded through icy rivers, hid in forests, and trusted strangers with their lives. On the Austrian side, the neutral government opened reception centers. Volunteers handed out blankets and hot drinks. Journalists recorded the stories of the people arriving exhausted, carrying nothing more than a suitcase and a handful of photographs. For the Soviet Union, this was a humiliation. For the United States, it was an opportunity to show what it stood for. President Eisenhower used his executive authority to admit thousands of these Hungarian refugees to the United States under emergency provisions. The American government, along with private organizations like the International Rescue Committee, organized transport, housing, and English classes. Newspapers ran stories about the Hungarian freedom fighters being welcomed into American communities. Some of those refugees were young professionals, engineers, or students. In American cities and suburbs, they saw things that had been almost unimaginable back home. Supermarkets full of goods, cars in every driveway, televisions in living rooms, and a culture of innovation that reached from the factory floor to the space program. To them, this was not just abundance, it was a visible proof that the system they had been taught to hate and fear was capable of something extraordinary. In the battle for hearts and minds, the United States did not just rely on political rhetoric, it pointed to its achievements. It pointed to the highway system, to mass production, to the transistor, to the jet age, to the computers that were beginning to reshape science and defense. It pointed, above all, to the race into space, culminating in the Apollo program that would put American astronauts on the moon. For Eastern Europeans listening to Radio Free Europe or Voice of America in secret, these achievements were not just distant headlines. They were proof that the communist narrative about a decadent, decaying West was a lie. Hungary was not the only country sending quiet messages of dissent through the movement of its people. In Poland, the story stretched across decades. The country had been devastated by the war, occupied first by Nazi Germany and then dominated by the Soviet Union, with borders redrawn and millions displaced. Under the new Polish communist regime, political repression, economic hardship, and periodic campaigns targeting specific groups drove many to look west.
In 1968, an anti-Semitic campaign launched by the Polish authorities led to thousands of Polish Jews losing their jobs, their positions, and their sense of belonging. Many were pushed to emigrate, often to countries like Sweden, Israel, or the United States. They left behind apartments, careers, and friends, carrying with them a bitter message that even after surviving the Holocaust and the war, they were not safe in a Soviet-backed socialist state. Through the 1970s and early 1980s, Poland became a laboratory of resistance. Workers' strikes in Gdansk and other cities gave birth to Solidarity, the first independent trade union recognized in the Eastern Bloc. Its leader, Lech Walesa, became a symbol of popular resistance not only in Poland, but around the world. The regime responded with martial law, arrests, and suppression. For many Poles, the choice became stark: stay and face an unpredictable future under martial law, or find a way out.
Some managed to secure official permission to travel for work, study, or tourism to Western Europe, and then simply never returned. Western governments and media started using a term for them: non-returners. People who left the Eastern Bloc with permission and then turned a temporary trip into a permanent escape. The United States watched this pattern closely. By the early 1960s, Washington had passed the Migration and Refugee Assistance Act, providing money and legal avenues to help refugees, particularly those fleeing communist countries, resettle in America. In 1980, the Refugee Act gave the president the authority to admit tens of thousands of refugees each year, aligning U.S. law with international definitions and allowing more people escaping authoritarian regimes, including the Eastern Bloc, to find a place in American society. For Soviet leaders, every Pole, Hungarian, or Czech who used a student visa, a scientific conference, or a cultural exchange to defect to the West was a propaganda disaster. It was a silent indictment of their own system. For American audiences, these stories began to form a pattern similar to what they had seen in World War II. Individuals facing totalitarian power, choosing risk and sacrifice over obedience, and finding a home in a country that prided itself on opportunity and freedom. Czechoslovakia had its own turning point in 1968. The reform leader Alexander Dubček promised socialism with a human face, easing censorship and encouraging open debate. For a few months, Prague became a city of hope. Writers, students, and workers talked about creating a more open, more democratic version of socialism. In August, tanks from the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact countries invaded. The reforms were rolled back, the leaders were removed. The period that followed was known as normalization, a euphemism for reimposing tight control. Once again, people had to choose between silence and escape. In the years after 1968, tens of thousands of Czechs and Slovaks left the country, often through neighboring Austria or West Germany. Some crossed borders illegally, others left legally and refused to return. They were writers, scientists, engineers, students, and ordinary workers who had lost faith that the system could ever be reformed from within. The pattern was familiar by now. On one side, Soviet tanks and secret police. On the other, Western embassies, refugee agencies, and airplanes waiting on tarmacs. American policymakers saw the political value in these escapes. Each one could be used to demonstrate that even inside the heart of the Eastern Bloc, people were choosing the West. Beyond the symbolic value, there was a crucial practical difference between the two sides. The United States could actually absorb these people. Its economy, driven by technology, industry, and a growing service sector, needed engineers, mechanics, doctors, and teachers. Many refugees from Eastern Europe were educated, skilled, and eager to work. They were quickly woven into American cities and suburbs, into laboratories and factories, into universities and offices. Behind the scenes, American immigration officers and intelligence agencies also saw these newcomers as sources of information. They could describe life behind the curtain, explain how Soviet-backed systems really functioned, and sometimes provide useful technical knowledge. For a country locked in a global rivalry with Moscow, this was a strategic bonus. From the Soviet perspective, the contrast was painful. Their own system struggled with shortages, inefficiency, and technological lag. They could launch satellites and build nuclear weapons, but they could not match the everyday consumer abundance of the United States. They could control borders, but they could not entirely control what people heard on Western radio or saw when they traveled abroad. By the 1970s, American policymakers took this dynamic and wrote it directly into law. The Trade Act of 1974 tied economic benefits, including favorable trade status, to the freedom of people in Eastern countries to emigrate. This policy helped around 500,000 people, including many Jews, Catholics, and other Christians, to leave the Soviet Union and its allies and resettle in places like the United States. Once again, the message was clear: if you allow your people to vote with their feet, we will welcome them. The Cold War was not only about rockets and tanks. It was about systems proving themselves in the eyes of ordinary people. The Eastern Bloc tried to project an image of unity, equality, and progress. The United States answered by pointing to its skyscrapers, its universities, its computers, its cars, its moon landings, and the steady flow of people risking everything to get in, not out. For refugees like those 1956 Hungarians, the experience of arriving in America could be overwhelming. International Rescue Committee records from that period show how agencies worked to find them housing, jobs, and English classes. Some arrived as unaccompanied minors. They were placed with foster families, attended American high schools, and went on to college with scholarships. Their path from Budapest streets to U.S. campuses was a living advertisement for what American society could offer. The same was true for many Poles and Czechs who resettled in the United States. They found themselves in a country where criticizing the government didn't mean a knock on the door at midnight, where standing in line was for movie tickets, not bread, where the debate was not about whether a factory could meet a 5-year plan, but when the next innovation would hit the market. Eastern Bloc officials understood the propaganda impact of these lives. That is why they tried so hard to seal the borders. That is why they monitored travelers, censored letters, jammed Western broadcasts, and punished families of defectors. But they could never completely close the information gap. Rumors traveled across borders. Stories came home. People knew, even if they had never seen it with their own eyes, that the United States was not the broken, desperate place described by official propaganda. Throughout these decades, from the Berlin blockade to the Cuban Missile Crisis to the invasion of Afghanistan, refugees from Eastern Europe kept arriving in the West. Some came in small groups, others in waves triggered by crises like Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968. Many ended up in the United States, where changing refugee laws created more consistent avenues for admission and resettlement. For Americans, their stories reinforced a powerful narrative. In World War II, they watched people flee Nazi tyranny and find refuge in the United States. During the Cold War, they saw something similar unfold again, this time with communism as the oppressive force. For Soviet leaders, each departure was not just a statistic, it was a crack in the facade.
The 1980 Refugee Act codified the U.S. commitment to offering a haven to people with a well-founded fear of persecution, including those escaping communist regimes. At the same time, American leaders knew that these policies had a strategic dimension. Every Hungarian, Polish, or Czechoslovakian refugee who became a productive citizen in the United States was a reminder to both East and West of which system seemed to be winning the long contest. By the late 1980s, the Eastern Bloc was under pressure from within and without. Economies were stagnant. Reform movements gained strength. In Hungary, pragmatic leaders began to open the border with Austria. Thousands of East Germans took advantage of this opening, traveling through Hungary and Czechoslovakia to reach the West. It was a refugee crisis that Soviet tanks did not roll out to stop. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall opened. A wave of East Germans, along with other Eastern Europeans, poured through the checkpoints into West Berlin. Some carried bags, many simply walked through, smiling, laughing, crying. The border that had been defended with mines, dogs, and machine guns for decades fell in a matter of hours. For people from Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia who had risked their lives in earlier years, watching that moment on television was surreal.
Borders that had once required fake papers, silent crossings through forests, and years of planning were now being crossed in broad daylight, with cameras rolling. The Cold War did not end with a single battle. It ended with a series of decisions, protests, reforms, and collapses. But among its most powerful symbols are the refugees who crossed from east to west and the societies that received them. The United States, with its economic dynamism and technological achievements, did not just impress them, it gave them a place to live out their lives. In an era defined by nuclear arsenals and ideological confrontation, the movement of these 500,000 Poles, Hungarians, and Czechoslovakians tells a more intimate story, a story of families walking into the night, of students stepping off airplanes into unfamiliar cities, of engineers finding work in American firms, and children from behind the Iron Curtain sitting in American classrooms learning a new language and a new way of life. For Soviet leaders, it was a constant reminder that the world they had built could not fully hold its people. For Americans, it was a testament to what their country represented in that era. Not perfection, but possibility. When you look back at the Cold War today, you can see the shadow of World War II in the way Americans understand these stories. Once again, there is an authoritarian system claiming superiority, and once again, there are people risking everything to escape it and start over under a different flag. Once again, the contrast is stark. State-controlled economies versus dynamic markets, censorship versus open debate, closed borders versus airports full of arrivals. The refugees from the Eastern Bloc did not defeat the Soviet system alone, but their choices, their journeys, and their lives in the West were part of a larger story about what convinced the world that one side of this conflict offered a future people were willing to risk everything to reach. In that sense, the 500,000 Poles, Hungarians, and Czechoslovakians who crossed into the West between 1945 and 1989 were more than victims, more than statistics. They were witnesses. Witnesses to the failures of the system they left behind, and witnesses to the power of the society they chose instead. And as they built new lives in the United States and other Western countries, working in factories and laboratories, starting businesses, raising families, they quietly answered one of the central questions of the Cold War: which side did people trust with their future? Their answer can be read in every border they crossed, every camp they passed through, every resettlement program that brought them to American cities and towns. It can be seen in every story of a former refugee watching the moon landing on an American television, hearing about new computer technologies, driving on interstate highways, and realizing that the world they had long imagined from behind the Iron Curtain was now the world they lived in. For a generation raised in the shadow of World War II, these Cold War refugee stories carried a familiar emotional charge. Pride in what the United States had built, fascination with the courage of those who escaped, curiosity about life on the other side of the curtain, and, above all, a sense that in this long, strange conflict, one side had proved its strength not just on battlefields or launch pads, but in the quiet, powerful testimony of the people who chose.